While shifting the newly found antique mirror into his room, the hallway floor groaned under the weight. Every time he pulled, the heavy frame shuddered, the base dragging against the wood with a high-pitched, abrasive screech that echoed off the empty walls. He leaned his shoulder against the frame, digging in for one final effort. He shoved it across the threshold of the bedroom, his boots slipping on the polished floor. The frame hit the door jamb with a dull, heavy thud that vibrated through the floorboards. He staggered, caught his balance, and forced the object toward the center of the room. It was a dead weight, resisting his every movement, pulling against him as if it had no intention of being moved. Finally, he shoved it into the corner. Mark gripped the frame, his knuckles white against the metal. He tilted the massive object upward, the weight shifting with a sickening slide that made his muscles burn. He adjusted his stance and pushed it toward the far wall opposite his bed. It was a delicate, dangerous balance. The base threatened to slide out from under him at every step. He stepped back to inspect the angle. It leaned slightly forward, tilting the perspective of the room. The bed appeared within the glass, mirrored perfectly, yet the space inside felt deeper, darker. Mark wiped his palms on his legs, the dust leaving streaks on his skin. He stood there for a long moment, watching the reflection of his own unmade bed, until the silence of the room felt heavy, pressing inward from the corners. He turned away, but the weight of the glass seemed to linger behind him. The day had worn him thin. Mark entered the bedroom, the air feeling cooler than he remembered. He bypassed the bed and walked straight to the vanity, his movements heavy and unhurried. He set the toothbrush down, squeezed the paste, and began the rhythmic scrub, his gaze fixed on the sink basin. He rinsed his mouth, spat into the porcelain, and reached for the towel. As he finished, he turned his head sharply toward the door, intending to flick the light switch. It was a fluid, practiced motion, but as he turned, he felt a strange, jarring disconnect in his periphery. He caught a glimpse of the mirror before his eyes, fully cleared the glass. His reflection did not turn with him. For a fraction of a second, the figure in the glass remained facing forward, eyes still fixed on the sink, before it jerked to catch up. The delay was microscopic, yet it hit him like a physical blow. He froze in the middle of the room, his hand hovering inches from the switch. The silence in the bedroom grew absolute. He stared at his own still image in the glass, waiting for a heartbeat, a breath, any sign that the world was still functioning as it should. Nothing moved. The room remained perfectly still, yet the back of his neck prickled with a cold, sharp intensity. Mark did not move. He kept his eyes locked on the glass, waiting for the anomaly to repeat. The figure inside stared back, perfectly still, perfectly matched. He took a slow breath, his chest rising and falling in rhythm with his reflection. He stepped closer, the floorboards groaning under his weight, until he was inches from the surface. He blinked. The reflection blinked. He leaned left, then right, mimicking the movement with deliberate, jerky precision. The glass responded instantly. There was no lag, no hesitation. He reached out, pressing his fingertips against the cold, smooth plane. The surface felt solid, unyielding. He leaned back, scanning the corners of the room where the shadows gathered in thick, uneven pools. The light from the single bulb flickered, casting a dim yellow glow that turned the edges of the furniture into jagged silhouettes. It had to be the light, the way the shadows played tricks on his exhausted eyes, the way the gloom distorted his depth perception. He let out a sharp, ragged laugh that sounded thin in the quiet room. It was just fatigue. He turned away from the mirror, his movements stiff and measured, and walked toward the bed. He pulled the covers back, climbed in, and stared up at the ceiling, waiting for his pulse to slow. The house settled into the deep, heavy silence of the small hours. Mark drifted in the borderland of exhaustion, his breathing shallow and even. Outside, the world was still. Not a leaf stirred against the window glass. Then, at exactly 3 o'clock, the silence fractured. It started as a dry, raspy scrape, like sandpaper, dragged slowly across aged wood. It was not the wind. There was no rhythm to the air outside, yet this sound possessed a deliberate, calculated cadence. Mark shifted, his eyes snapping open in the dark. The room was cold, the air thick with the smell of trapped dust. He lay perfectly still, his pulse thudding against the mattress, listening. The sound came again, sharper this time, a dry rasp that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards beneath his bed. He sat up, the sheets sliding from his chest, and clutched the edge of the blanket. His skin felt damp, with a cold, sudden sweat. He held his breath, straining to locate the source, but the bedroom was a void of blackness. He pressed his palms into the mattress, his muscles coiled and ready to bolt, as the silence returned, heavier and more oppressive than before. He scanned the room, his eyes darting toward the mirror, waiting for the sound to repeat. The silence did not last. It pulled apart, thread by thread, replaced by a low-frequency hum that seemed to crawl up from the floorboards. Mark leaned forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the headboard. The sound shifted. It was no longer a scrape. It was a voice, or a dozen voices, layered into a single, wet, raspy cadence. They were whispering. The words were impossible to parse, tumbling over each other in a frantic, rhythmic chant. He squeezed his eyes shut, hoping to drown out the noise, but the vibration intensified, drilling directly into the back of his skull. It was not coming from the hallway. It was not coming from the window. The sound was pulsating, rhythmic, and heavy, radiating from the mirror across the room. He forced his eyes open, his pupils dilated in the gloom. The silver-backed surface seemed to ripple, as if the glass were made of thick, agitated oil. The whispering grew louder, a chorus of dry, papery breaths that demanded his attention. Mark tried to pull his legs toward his chest to retreat, but his muscles refused to obey. He was locked in place, his breath hitching in his throat, as the unintelligible chant filled every corner of the bedroom. The mirror was no longer just a piece of furniture. It was the source of the sound, and it was calling to him. The whispering hit a sharp, sudden peak, then vanished. In the vacuum left behind, a new sound emerged, a frantic, metallic clatter. The mirror began to rattle. It shuddered within its heavy frame, the sound of glass striking metal, echoing through the bedroom like a rapid, uneven heartbeat. Mark watched, his chest heaving, as the object bucked against the wall. He threw his legs off the bed, his feet hitting the floorboards, and lunged forward to steady it. He stopped inches away, his hands hovering in the air. The mirror was vibrating with enough force to blur the edges of the room, yet the rest of the bedroom remained perfectly, impossibly still. The curtains hung limp. The dust motes in the air did not stir. A single pen on the nightstand remained unmoved, despite the floorboards beneath his feet trembling from the mirror's violent motion. The clatter grew louder, a sharp, rhythmic drumming that threatened to crack the glass. Mark pressed his back against the wall, his palms flat against the cold plaster, watching the mirror fight its own boundaries. It was as if something trapped inside the surface was trying to punch its way out, shaking the heavy frame with a strength that defied the laws of the house. He could not look away, his focus locked onto the center of the shaking glass. The rattling ceased as abruptly as it had begun. A sudden, dead silence reclaimed the room, heavier than before. Mark pushed himself upright, his spine rigid against the headboard, his heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that felt too loud in the stillness. He kept his eyes fixed on the mirror, waiting for the glass to settle. The surface was still, yet the image within it remained warped. Mark blinked, rubbing his eyes, but the sight did not change. His reflection was not lying down, it had shifted. The figure in the glass was already sitting up, its spine angled forward, mirroring the exact position Mark had just adopted. But the movement was wrong. It was too fluid, too deliberate. Mark held his breath, his hands gripping the sheets until his knuckles ached. The reflection did not wait for him to move again. It leaned toward the surface of the glass, its head tilted at an impossible angle. The eyes in the mirror were fixed on him, wide and unblinking. There was no mimicry left in that gaze. It was a predatory focus, a cold, calculated observation that stripped away the safety of the bedroom. Mark sat paralyzed, watching his own face stare back at him with an intensity that made the air in the room feel thin and freezing. The silence in the bedroom became a physical weight. Mark felt the air thicken, pressing against his chest, making every breath a shallow, ragged effort. He could not look away from the mirror. The figure in the glass was leaning further now, hands braced against the inner surface, its gaze locked onto his with an unnerving, predatory hunger. Mark needed light. He needed to shatter the illusion, to prove the world still functioned by the rules of physics. He forced his right arm to move. It felt heavy, as if his muscles were packed with lead. He gritted his teeth, the sound sharp in the quiet room, and pushed his hand toward the nightstand. His fingers brushed the wood, sliding slowly, agonizingly, toward the lamp switch. Every inch was a battle against his own lethargy. His vision blurred at the edges, but he kept his focus on the plastic toggle. He reached out, his trembling fingertips finally finding the cool, smooth surface of the switch. He curled his index finger around the plastic. The reflection in the glass seemed to watch him with mocking patience. Mark tensed, his knuckles white, and prepared to snap the switch upward to flood the room with safety. Mark jammed his thumb against the switch. A sharp, hollow click echoed through the room, but the lamp remained dark. He blinked, his heart skipping a beat, and tried again. Click, click, click. The sound was rhythmic and frantic, yet the bulb did not offer even a single flicker of life. The room stayed submerged in heavy, suffocating shadow. He pressed the switch down with his full weight, holding it there, praying for the sudden spark of electricity to cut through the gloom. Nothing. The darkness felt absolute, a dense curtain that refused to part. Mark pulled his hand back, as if the switch had burned him. He looked toward the mirror, his breath coming in short, jagged gasps. Without the light, the room felt hollowed out, stripped of its familiar shapes and safety. He could still feel the presence of the glass in the corner, a dark, vertical void. The air grew colder, vibrating with a low, imperceptible hum that seemed to pulse from the walls themselves. He sat frozen, his back pressed hard against the headboard, listening to the silence. It was no longer empty. The darkness was watching him, and the mirror was the only thing left that held any light. Mark held his breath, his eyes straining against the gloom. He expected the glass to remain a passive surface, a mere trick of the eye. Then, a low, scraping sound grated against his ears. It was the sound of skin dragging across cold, polished silica. The figure inside the frame shifted. It did not just mirror his posture. It leaned forward with a deliberate, heavy motion. Mark watched, his pulse hammering against his ribs, as two hands pressed firmly against the inside of the glass. The reflection's palms flattened, spreading wide, and where they met the surface, dark, oily smudges began to bloom. The residue smeared against the interior, a greasy trail that lingered even as the fingers twitched. It was not a projection of light. It was a physical exertion. The glass groaned under the pressure, a thin, high-pitched vibration that rippled through the frame. Mark saw the smudges clearly now, dark streaks that defied the laws of reflection. His own face in the glass remained fixed, but the palms were moving, kneading the surface, as if testing the thickness of the barrier. Each press left a mark, a tangible stain of something viscous and wrong. The barrier was failing, and the hand behind the glass was already beginning to push through. Mark lunged backward, his heels catching the edge of the mattress to propel him away from the glass. He expected the sudden, sharp movement of flight, but his body turned to stone. His legs felt like they were submerged in thick, drying cement. He pushed again, straining every muscle in his thighs, but they remained dead weight, anchored to the bed. A cold, heavy pressure settled over his chest, pinning him against the headboard. He tried to twist away, to roll off the side of the bed and crawl toward the door, but his limbs refused to obey. Each nerve ending seemed to be firing into a vacuum. He opened his mouth to scream, to call out for help, but his throat was constricted, tight and dry. No sound emerged. He was fully awake, fully aware, yet trapped within the cage of his own skin. His hands clawed at the bed sheets, fingers bunching the fabric, but he could not lift his arms. He watched, helpless, as the figure in the mirror pushed further against the glass. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, ignoring his struggle. The reflection took another step forward, its form growing clearer, its presence expanding to fill the narrow space between the mirror and the bed. The reflection reached the threshold of the glass. It moved with a rhythmic, liquid fluidity that defied the rigidity of the frame. Mark could do nothing but watch as the figure leaned in. It did not blink. It did not look away. It brought its face forward until it was mere millimeters from the inside of the surface. Mark felt a sudden, sharp drop in the room temperature, a chill that radiated from the mirror like a physical force. The reflection's nose pressed against the glass, flattening slightly against the cold, hot pain. It was a stark, pale point of contact. The pressure left a small, frosted circle of condensation that blossomed outward. Then, the eyes arrived. They were fixed, wide, and entirely unblinking, staring directly into Mark's dilated pupils. There was no depth in those eyes, only a hollow, void-like intensity that seemed to drain the light from the room. Mark felt his own breath hitch in his throat as the gaze locked onto him. It was a tether, an invisible hook pulling him into the dark glass. The reflection remained perfectly still, its nose crushed against the barrier, its eyes never wavering. It was observing him, measuring the distance between their two worlds, and waiting for the final seal to break. The reflection did not break the stare. Instead, it began to work on its own face. It raised its fingers, pressing the tips firmly into the corners of its mouth. The skin did not bunch or fold. It stretched like wet clay. Mark watched in frozen horror as the reflection pulled the edges of its lips outward. The skin thinned, turning translucent, yet it did not tear. It kept extending, inch by inch, past the natural limits of a human jaw. The corners of the mouth crept toward the ears, carving a cavernous, jagged line across the lower half of the face. It was a slow, deliberate mutilation that defied the structure of bone and muscle. The reflection's expression remained vacant, a stark contrast to the violent contortion of its features. With every millimeter of extension, the jaw seemed to unhinge, creating a gaping, angular void. The skin around the mouth pulled taut, revealing white gums and flat, serrated ridges where teeth should have been. It was a mask of impossible geometry. The reflection held a pose, its fingers still buried in the edges of its own flesh, showing Mark the full, horrific extent of the widening, jagged smile that now bisected its entire face. The reflection did not stop at the smile. It began to laugh. There was no audible voice, no intake of breath, and no vocal cord tension. Instead, a deep, rhythmic vibration surged from the glass. It hit the bedroom like a physical shockwave. The heavy mirror rattled violently in its frame, the wood groaning against the wall. Mark felt the frequency in his own chest, a hollow thumping that matched the pulsing of the reflection's throat. The air in the room grew thick, vibrating with the force of the soundless mirth. Every surface reacted. The bed frame shuddered. The loose change on the nightstand danced against the wood. The floorboards beneath Mark's feet hummed with a low-frequency hum that turned his blood cold. It was a rhythmic, frantic shaking that seemed to dismantle the reality of the room. Mark pressed his palms against the mattress, trying to ground himself, but the vibration was everywhere. It was a bone-deep dread that locked his muscles. The reflection rocked back and forth, its chest heaving in silent, violent spasms. The walls seemed to bow under the pressure of the unseen noise, and the shadows in the corners of the room flickered in time with the jagged, silent laughter that filled the space. The vibration cut out as abruptly as it had begun. Silence rushed back into the bedroom, heavier than before. Mark stared at the glass, his breath hitching in his throat. The surface of the mirror began to ripple. It moved not like solid quartz, but like the dark, stagnant water of a deep pond when a stone hits the center. Concentric circles of distortion spread outward from the center of the glass. The reflection vanished behind a veil of gray, swirling fog. Then, the center of the mirror bulged outward. The silvered surface stretched, thinning until it became translucent, a membrane separating two worlds. A pale hand pushed through. It did not break the glass. It passed through the material, as if the mirror were nothing more than thick, cold smoke. Fingers emerged first, long and rigid, curling into the air of the bedroom. The skin looked waxy, devoid of any natural warmth. The hand flexed, its joints popping with a wet, sharp sound that echoed off the bedroom walls. It hovered for a heartbeat, palm open, testing the air. Then, the wrist followed, sliding through the shimmering surface with a soft, sliding friction. The hand moved with intent, reaching out into the bedroom, its fingers twitching as it sought a purchase in the physical reality of the room. The pale hand drifted through the stagnant air, fingers splayed wide. It tapped the wooden headboard, testing the solidity of the material with a rhythmic, metallic clicking. Then, it descended. The fingers hooked over the edge of the mattress, digging into the fabric until the knuckles turned white against the dark weave. The material bunched and tore under the pressure of the grip. Mark watched as the mattress frame groaned, the weight of something heavy pulling down on the left side of the bed. The bed tilted, sliding an inch across the floorboards with a sharp, screeching sound. The hand did not tremble. It tightened its hold, the thumb pressing deep into the padding, anchoring itself firmly to the frame. The fabric stretched to its breaking point, fibers snapping one by one under the unnatural force. The entity began to pull. The bed frame buckled, the metal legs scraping against the floor as the entire structure shifted toward the mirror. Mark felt the mattress tilt further, his own body sliding toward the edge as the entity solidified its leverage. The grip was absolute. There was no hesitation in the movement, only the steady, calculated tension of something preparing to haul its entire mass into the room. The entity leaned into the pull, the mattress sinking under the weight of an unseen body, pressing forward from the other side of the glass. The mirror frame groaned as the entity surged forward. Wood splintered where the glass met the wall, small shards raining down onto the floorboards. The reflection did not wait. It pulled its shoulders through the surface, the skin of its back scraping against the edges of the silver frame with the sound of grinding stone. Its head popped into the room first, the neck twisting at an impossible angle to clear the threshold. The hair hung limp, matted with the same gray fog that had swirled inside the glass. Then came the torso. The entity hauled itself upward, muscles bunching on the skin that looked like wet, translucent parchment. It did not move with grace, but with a raw, mechanical efficiency. It shoved its chest through the plane, the mirror surface bowing inward like rubber before snapping back into place once the mass had cleared. The entity dropped onto the mattress, its weight causing the frame to slam against the floor. It sat upright, his wide, jagged mouth stretching further across its face. It turned its head, the joints in its neck popping, to fix its gaze on Mark. The grin was fixed, a permanent, unnatural crescent that exposed rows of flat, stained teeth. It was no longer a reflection. It was here. The creature stood, its head brushing the bedroom ceiling as it rose to its full height. The air in the room grew frigid. The sudden drop in temperaure, causing the remaining moisture on the floorboards to frost over. It loomed over the center of the bed, its presence acting like a physical weight that pinned Mark to the mattress. Every time Mark tried to draw a breath, the creature exhaled, a rhythmic, raspy wind that smelled of stagnant water and old dust. It shifted its stance, the springs beneath the mattress groaning in protest as they compressed under an unnatural, heavy density. A long, distorted shadow stretched from the entity's frame, crawling across the sheets and climbing up the wall behind Mark. The room grew darker, the faint moonlight completely eclipsed by the looming mass. The creature leaned forward, its neck stretching unnaturally long as it descended toward Mark's face. It did not blink. It did not sway. It remained perfectly, terrifyingly still, a pillar of cold shadow that blocked every exit and every path of escape. Mark stared up, his eyes locked onto the creature's face, watching as the shadow deepened, swallowing his hands, his chest, and finally his vision, until nothing remained but the suffocating darkness of the entity's presence. The entity hovered inches from Mark, its skin pressing against his own. It was not warm. It was the temperature of the glass it had left behind. Mark felt the creature's breath, a rhythmic, dry rasp that rattled against his lips. It raised a hand, its fingers long and stiff, and pressed them against Mark's cheeks. The contact felt like ice, numbing the nerves beneath the skin. Mark watched the creature's eyes. They were not human. They were deep, empty pits that held no light, only a void that seemed to pull at his own consciousness. The creature tilted its head, mimicking the motion Mark had made hours earlier, but with a predatory, calculated intent. It leaned further, pressing its nose against Mark's, the pressure forcing Mark's head back into the pillow. The room faded into a blur of gray light and shadow. The creature's grin widened, the skin around its mouth stretching until it threatened to tear. Mark felt his own strength drain away, channeled into the entity that now occupied his space. The creature blinked, a slow, deliberate movement that signaled the end of the mimicry. It let out a soft, low vibration that shook the bed frame. Mark could no longer move, no longer speak, no longer exist. He stared into those hollow, hungry eyes and saw his own life extinguished in the reflection.